Hi all, and welcome back to another edition of the Millennial Cynic with me, Sarah. I do hope you're all keeping well. So today let's take a look at the current political landscape, shall we? Well, first of all, as I'm sure we ordinary citizens are fully aware, there are a multitude of crises hitting us all at once. We have the ongoing housing crisis, the healthcare crisis, the cost of living crisis, and the energy crisis, to name just the headline acts. Whether Budget 2023 will actually help ordinary people through these crises remains to be seen, but so far it feels like far too many plasters over the symptoms and not enough treating the actual causes. But we are not the only ones here in Ireland suffering through a crisis. Our political rulers are also neck deep in their own crisis, a crisis of the polls. So, what do the latest opinion polls tell us? Well, they tell us loud and clear that the current government is steadily losing what little support it has, and the main opposition parties are holding steady. Again, it will remain to be seen whether Budget 2023 will actually change anything at all in this regard. So there are a couple of points to take note of when we discuss polls like this. Firstly, they are just a guideline and have been wrong in the past. We only have to look at the last general election to see that even Sinn Féin themselves could not have expected the outcome of general election 2020. The polls had them holding steady despite a poor showing at the local and European elections, and so they reined in the number of candidates that they were to run. The day itself showed that they could have swept the board had they kept those extra candidates, as first preference votes were far higher than anyone could have predicted. Now, obviously, there are a few possible reasons for this. Firstly, while they were holding steady in the polls, perhaps many prospective voters were unwilling to admit that they would in fact vote for Sinn Féin. There is also the media bias, perceived or otherwise, that could cause a rebellious vote in favour of the party that the establishment have no time for. Whatever the reasons, the polls didn't tell the whole story. And while the current government can take some solace in that fact, they also have to face the reality that they are losing support. They are losing the people and losing the voters. None of the latest polls make for very good reading at all. Most have Sinn Féin sitting high atop, while we have government parties struggle against the tide. We have the Greens floundering at around 2%, not exactly a mandate for anything, let alone government right there. We have Gael at an all-time low of 18%, or a slightly better 21% depending on the poll. Fianna Fáil don't fare much better, sitting at about 16 to 17%, a far cry for all from the Sinn Féin position. And this is seemingly terrifying the current government, and each are dealing with these polls in their own ways. So first we have the Greens, who surely can see that the writing is well and truly on the wall for them. The Green wave was more of a ripple, it seems, as people quickly realised that the manner in which the Green Party wished to enact their green initiatives was going to see us very much out of pocket, with little incentive to go along with them. I have covered this in more detail in my episode on who pays for climate change, but long story short, the Greens used far too much stick and couldn't find any carrots. So, how are the Greens dealing with their seemingly inevitable demise? Well, by hanging on in government for as long as they can, propping up a failing and faltering government through scandal after scandal. All so they can push through as many green initiatives as possible, knowing that both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael know that the Greens can pull the plug at any moment if their whims are not seen to. Although I have to be honest, I think the allure of the gravy train has very much taken over any moral responsibility the Greens may have thought they had. So it's a pointless game of chicken, really. The Greens can threaten to pull the plug, while the big two know that if they do, the Greens won't be back near government benches for a long time. So a lovely game of chicken, where the electorate lose. Yay! Next, let's talk about Fine Gael. So what have they been up to, knowing how little support they have? Well, Fine Gael be Fine Gaeling, that's what. The usual electioneering soundbites from them, only now with more rhetoric and even less action. all talk about putting money back in people's pockets. I'm assuming the people who get up in the morning, but who knows anymore? They do love a good slogan after all. More useless sound bites about how they must do this or must do that. Well, lads, you've had 11 years. Surely all those musts should have been policy long before today. But no, they seemingly need more time to fix the problems. No, not the problems Fianna Fáil left them with in the wake of the great financial crash. No. This time it's the problems they've caused themselves, but are too arrogant to admit to. Another big strategy from the Fine Gael playbook has been enacted in earnest lately, that being, won't somebody think of Sinn Féin? Seriously, pick nearly any Fine Gaeler and check out their Twitter, and I am quite sure you'll find a pop or two at Sinn Féin in there, even though, they've never had any power or influence here at all. But still, according to Fine Gael, everything is Sinn Féin's fault, or they'll somehow make things worse. Now, I've spoken about this in a previous episode as well, but it bears repeating. Sinn Féin are not the cause of any of the problems we are currently facing. Will they make a better go of things if, or more likely when, they get into the hot seat? We can only hope, but surely they can't be much worse than the current crop. In Fine Gael's haste, however, to lambast Sinn Féin at any and every opportunity, they've scored a few own goals and administered some wondrous self-burns in the process. First up, Leo Varadkar, among others, having a pop at the Taxation Commission, the expert group commissioned by the government, for suggesting some changes that happen to be changes Sinn Féin are also calling for. Every party had the chance to submit proposals to the Commission for consideration, and yet, lo and behold, the loudest critics didn't bother their arse submitting anything at all, even though they set up the Commission in the first place. So, they have a pop at a commission they set up and didn't bother doing the homework for. Yep, that sounds like Fine Gael all right. Another spectacular self-burn came after Sinn Féin launched their own budget proposals. Sinn Féin have suggested and indeed implored the government to implement an energy price cap at pre-crisis prices and to introduce a windfall tax on the profits. Now, the government seemingly only want the windfall tax, with Green leader Eamon Ryan bizarrely calling energy caps Tory-like, and Fine Gael's Pascal Donoghue claiming that it will be like writing a blank cheque, in spite of many other European countries enacting the same. But another aspect of Sinn Féin's proposals was that instead of the one-size-fits-all approach the government are taking with a universal payment to every household, Sinn Féin instead want to have the payment on a sliding scale to target the less well-off. Those earning over $70,000 a year would not get a payment but would instead benefit from the lower capped prices. Now, that sounds fair enough to me, but not to Fine Gael. Oh no, they're not happy at all. So much so that Josepha Madigan took to Twitter to have a pop at Sinn Féin by tweeting the following. She said, "A totally discriminatory proposal makes the erroneous assumption that a person earning over €70,000 has discretionary spend at the end of the month. Many are stretched at present, a hard-working person being penalised for populism." Right. Where do you begin with this utter tripe? So, first of all, anyone earning $70,000 a year is in the top 13 or so % of earners here in Ireland. So how are they struggling? Most people earn far, far less than that. So how does she think these people get by? But let's pretend for a moment that she's right and anyone and everyone earning $70,000 a year struggles. Who would be responsible for that? Which party does Josepha Madigan think caused someone in that high bracket of earners to struggle? I'll give her a little clue. It ain't Sinn Féin. In her haste to take a potshot at the biggest threat to her position in government, she forgot that if what she says is true, that her government and its policies have caused someone earning that much to struggle. Like I said, spectacular self-burn. And let's not even waste our breath on Blackrock councillor, who was co-opted to that seat, by the way, not voted in, Maurice Dockrell, who decided to have not one but two pops at the many thousands of people, ordinary, hard-working, fed-up and abandoned citizens who marched against the establishment on Saturday 24th of September to highlight the cost of living crisis we are all facing. Well, I say we are all facing, but let's face it, the political class won't be worrying about heating costs this winter, will they? Just more of the same from Fine Gael. Utter disdain for the working class or those less well off. I'll stop there and I won't waste my breath any further. Instead, I'll just leave these tweets here before he deletes both of them. So that's what Fine Gael have been up to and what the Greens have been up to. So what about their coalition party colleagues? What of Fianna Fáil? How have they been coping with their poor polling? Well, by having an existential crisis and going back to their corrupt roots, it would seem. Now, I've covered the Robert Troy debacle in the last episode, and yes, in case you were wondering, he is still a TD, earning €101,000 a year, plus expenses, soon to be increased because of course our public representatives deserve a pay rise to get them through this tough cost of living crisis. It's enough to make you sick, isn't it? Anyway, he's still there with his 11 properties and his forgetfulness. And you'd think he'd be keeping his head down, right? You'd be thinking he'd be keeping his powder dry, keeping out of the spotlight. Yeah, well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong. No. Instead of having even an ounce of shame, Robert Troy was front and centre beside An Taoiseach and Fianna Fáil party leader Micheál Martin at their recent party think-in in Troy's backyard of Mullingar. The decision was made to have himself standing on Micheál's shoulder as Martin waffled to the media, with zero self-awareness and no shame, where he spoke about making a difference to the betterment of people. I'm assuming when he says people, he means people who are his buddies, but anyway, and waffled about building homes and fixing the housing crisis, all while 11 Properties Troy stood beside him, trying not to look too guilty. If AIB back brave, then Fianna Fáil must back brazenness and cronyism and corruption. If that public endorsement of Robert Troy isn't enough proof, then there's more. Fianna Fáil are considering the unthinkable and are somehow thinking that it could work. They are thinking of bringing back the main man responsible for so much austerity and suffering. The man who won it on the horses. The man who had no bank account. The man who told people who moaned about the economy to commit suicide. Yes, that man, Bertie Ahern, the crony-in-chief himself. The man who jumped before current Fianna Fáil leader Micheál Martin could push him. Yep, his former party colleagues believe he's been out in the cold for too long and now is the time to bring him back. Even Micheál himself thinks enough time has passed, so everything is just rosy again. It has been 10 years after all. Seemingly, the current crop of Fianna Fáil politicians think that Bertie's contribution to the peace process in the north, which, it has to be said, feels quite overblown when you consider just how many players were actually involved, but they think that is enough of a reason to bring him back into the fold, that whatever he did there is enough to cancel out and indeed outweigh all of the many wrongs. The whispers seem to be either he may be drafted in to help with the Northern Ireland Protocol, or perhaps a run for the Áras. It is genuinely concerning that somehow Fianna Fáil believe this to be worthy of consideration, never mind openly spoken about. This is the man who spearheaded the property bubble and subsequent crash that ruined so many lives here in Ireland. What are they thinking? Have they gone insane? How many advisors, paid for by the taxpayer I might add, are in the employ of Fianna Fáil, and yet seemingly no one has popped up to point out the bloody obvious that this might not be well received by the Irish electorate? I don't think it's a stretch for me to say that while Bertie might well be welcomed back by Fianna Fáil, he will not be welcomed back by ordinary people who are still paying for the bailout, still struggling. But is it really surprising that Fianna Fáil are, at the very least, thinking out loud about this? Not really. When you take a look at Micheál Martin, here's the man who tried to oust Bertie before he walked himself. The man who went into a grand coalition with Fine Gael, despite a campaign that swore they wouldn't, because he was desperate to become Taoiseach. The man who wanted to turn Fianna Fáil's fortunes around after the financial crash and show the country that they have changed. Yet he's also the man who stood by Robert Troy, a man who seemingly embodies old Fianna Fáil, Bertie's Fianna Fáil. And why? Well, just this past week it emerged that Micheál's Dublin apartment has not been declared on the Dáil register. Why? Because it's in his wife's name. Now, I don't know about you, but that is a fairly bullshit argument. A married couple in Ireland is assessed jointly for tax, and a married or cohabiting couple are assessed jointly for any and all social welfare. Yet here we have Micheál claiming that since the apartment is in his wife's name, there's no need for him to declare it. Straight out of the Fianna Fáil playbook, that one is. Bertie would be proud. So you see, Fianna Fáil are still that same party, still the chancers, still looking for and exploiting any loopholes they can find at the expense of the ordinary Irish citizen. But whatever the reason for this talk of Bertie, it's just not good enough. And we all need to remind ourselves of just what type of man Bertie Ahern is, and judge anyone who defends him accordingly. Even if Fianna Fáil don't actually bring him back, the fact that the thought, the idea, was there in the first place, and that they were brazen enough to utter it out loud, is enough of a reason to deeply, deeply distrust them. So all in all, I think it's fair to say that the current government don't really think too highly of us ordinary people. They're happy to push through agendas that are hurting people financially, happy to stand back and allow the markets to dictate the pace, happy to allow the cost of living crisis to continue with no real appetite to actually fix the problems. They're happy to laugh at people protesting and abdicate any and all responsibility for why people are protesting in the first place. And worst of all, one party thinks so little of us that they are actually considering bringing back the worst of them all. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on the current government landscape. I'll be back again soon with more issues of the day and more analysis. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more from me. I'm also still tweeting away into the void on Twitter if you'd like to see my instant reactions to the news of the day. Thanks again for joining me. Slán go fóill.